C-A-U-L-T, and John Constable, C-O-N-S-T-A-B-L-E. Put in the first slide, please. The first painter, whose works we will see today, lived a very short time, only 33 years, dying from complications after a riding accident. His dates are 1791 to 1824. With Gericault's works, we have sort of an uneven balance, sometimes masterfully drawn, sometimes very ineptly drawn. Sometimes the paint surface is brusque and broad, sometimes smooth as the classicists. Except we have with one painting that we will see in a few minutes, called The Raft of the Medusa, the transition painting between the school of classicism founded by David and the Romantic movement that was to take over through the middle part of the 19th century in French painting. This is all summed up with Gericault's whole intent on this early painting. The introduction of sort of violence and action within the painting technique. As I said, after last week, after the fall of the French court, there was also a fall within the Academy, in that a rebellion against the formalized methods of the Academy, and then the classic method set up by David became just as bad as what they had superseded. And it is within the confines of classicism that most of the students' work was being done at that time, and then there was a rebellion right after the French Revolution of around the 1800s, where the feeling of Romanticism, the exotic, the violent, the unusual, was taking precedent over the stiff, controlled, calm, serene, but coldly calculated classic paintings of the Academy. Gericault was a masterful horseman, and horses played a great part in his artwork. Just the thought of the horse, the symbol of the horse, the one of ego, of sort of animal motion, of power. The large animal, with what it could do, it could be trained, except it had a vibrant spirit all of its own. And you find the horse used constantly throughout most of his work. The generals, sort of a semi-portrait and yet an active portrait, entirely different, where you don't have, as in the Velasquez painting of King Philippe, the sort of stuffed-looking horse that you might find in the artist's studio. This, you have the feeling of the animal spirit, the violence of the battle going on in the background. The Romantics were very interested in contemporary historical events, but they placed them in contemporary dress also, whereas, say, David would have made it an allegory and placed it in some conjunction with a Roman or Greek classic story. Slide, please. Gericault's brushwork is broad, rich. It's not anymore the smooth, licked-over surfaces of the classic school. In some of his presentation things for the Academy or the salons, there was a complete technical ability in handling, although in these pieces where you have a much more spirited application of the paint. Slide, please. The dying general, just the thought of a soldier in the midst of some emotional throes, that you feel the activity of the moment, whereas in a David, the emotion is drained, even though it's a fairly violent or emotional scene is presented on a very cold scale. Slide, please. This is the horse fair. There was one race that he did several different versions of. It's where the horses were sort of scared and goaded into sort of a frenzy, and then there was a riderless horse race where then finally the horses were let loose without the rider. They were confined within the track, and this became the race. But it shows a great amount of power. In technique, or characteristics of technique, you don't have a feeling of classicism at all in Gericault's work. He is the beginning of the Romantic movement. There's a strong light source, but of course there was one also in David's work. But Gericault's light source forms sort of drama. It spotlights areas, it highlights pieces of it. Other things are in shadow, sort of dramatic, theatrical shadow. You see marvelous silhouettes appearing against the background. The lighting reverses itself, but always there's this feeling of power, of violence, of activity within his work. Slide, please. Even in this, which is still the play on the same riderless horse, that the horse is the spirited thing. Very seldom do you see a person mounted on the horse. He uses the horse as a symbol of this spirit. In this, where the figures are sort of holding back the horse, you have almost a simplification of detail in here that suggests much later painting, of where the modeling is reduced to simple shades of light and dark areas, but a strong light source, a dramatic effect. Slide, please. And then his great masterpiece, probably his fame, rests on this one painting, and this is just a sketch of the painting. We'll see the finished work in a minute. Was based on a contemporary theme, and the legwork, the background, the historical documentation that went into this painting doesn't make it sort of a happenstance, but it was calculated to bring the effect that Gericault wanted it to produce. There was a sailing ship, the Medusa, that sunk off the coast of Africa, a British ship. From the wreckage, some survivors, there were about 149 survivors, formed a raft. It was also thought of in story, possibly, that from the lifeboat that was occupied by the officers, that the line was cut from the raft, and these men allowed to drift out into the open sea. By the time that they were picked up, only 15 out of the 149 had survived thirst, madness, and cannibalism. It was a horrible effect. And Gericault selected just the moment of discovery, the sort of absolute climax of the whole horrid tale, of where the sort of mass of volumes of figures piled up into this sort of pyramidal effect, which sort of goes back to an earlier revolt against classicism, as the top figure sort of limply waves a rag to a distant ship on the horizon. So the whole emotion of the scene is built up to this one pitch of discovery of the raft and the saving of the survivors. Slide, please. It created absolute hysteria, bedlam, emotional triumph in the Salon show when it was exhibited. It was sort of naively titled The Shipwreck in the catalog for the Salon, but everybody knew exactly what it was. Whereas David would select the most perfectly proportioned models and then draw them in the studio and then modify them so that they would fit within their composition. Gericault sought out some of the survivors to do his sketching from. One of them was even the ship's carpenter that told him how the raft was constructed and how it was put together for accuracy. The whole pilings of figures lead up to the one sort of pyramidal point of a Negro that, according to the fact that there was a Negro as a member aboard the ship, but also it's sort of a double meaning of the exotic type person that will be introduced. The lower left-hand section with his hand resting on is sort of out of place in this, sort of a return to David's classic proportions, but the rest of the figures become very lifelike. He would even go to insane asylums and sketch the people going mad, or to hospitals sketching people that had died. And it was even said that he would keep corpses in his studio, sketching from them until the neighbors complained of the odor, and then he had to get rid of them. But accuracy of detail went into this painting, and the whole effect of it was to produce this sort of emotional repulsion of the painting, and this is exactly what it did. Where the Oath of the Horatii of David was the painting, the sort of standard bearer of the classic movement, the Raft of the Medusa was the standard bearer for all romantic painting to follow. Slide, please. There are some details of the figures within the painting. Slide, please. In this, which is a straight presentation of a horse, probably of a certain horse, since it's so detailed, he gains still the sort of emotional effect, even in a portrait of a horse, by placing it against such a stormy, dramatic background. The sort of eerie light that highlights the shine on the horse's hide, but the darkness silhouetting the background, sort of making the horse stand out in silhouette. Slide, please. This almost reminds me of the delicacy of a Degas that we'll see later on. Slide, please. Slide, please. Gericault made a trip to England to view the horse races. And it was at this time he did the sketches. Slide, please. His color has sort of in most of the things, obviously from some pigments that he used, are the varnishes, a slightly greenish tinge to the surface. Slide, please. Slide, please. This one's called the Horse Fair. Even though he does use some buildings in some of his earlier work, it sort of has a tendency to lean toward Roman classic architecture. Most of the times it's just a sort of stable type architecture that has no distinction of its own. Slide, please. This sketch and the next one were portraits that he did of inmates of an insane asylum. Now this was completely unusual for an artist to portray these sort of types of portraits, or even want to do them. Painting was at this point held to the highest degree, and everybody portrayed had the status of gods or heroes. You did not portray the average man, and certainly not one that was sort of untypical of the average one, an insane person. Slide, please. And also this portrait. Slide, please. It was a slightly different one, although we will see his style develop, and this is very early. This is the second painter, John Constable. And his dates, much later than Gainsborough, were 1776 to 1837. So this places his birth right at the time of our American Revolution. And within his style, although he was fairly late in being discovered, he was had a much better reputation in Europe rather than in his own land of England, did not become very prominent until after his 50th year, around 1825, 1830, somewhere in there. The first landscapes, the early ones, such as this, are just sort of set pieces. They show no distinctive style. They are not unique. Just landscape scenes. And Constable, one of the very few English painters of this period of time, concentrated on the landscape. Although he made his living at portrait paintings, these are practically non-existent. His landscapes were the sought-after things. What he did to the landscape in the early 1800s through 1825 led the way for Impressionism 75 years later. Slide, please. He had great influence on the French painters of the Romantic period. In fact, one that we'll see, he won the gold medal in the Paris Salon in 1825, influenced Delacroix greatly in the use of breaking up of color. The first one's fairly somber, as most of the early painters used a low-key palette. But one thing that Constable did was get quick impressions in his sketches, quick oil sketches, tiny things, but they have the vibrancy of maybe later abstract painters, of where he would get down an immediate effect of nature without doing too much intellectual thought about the development of the composition. And these things show a great emotion to the presentation. Slide, please. These are still quite early ones. Slide, please. And in this we see a further development. Now with Gainsborough, you have a darker color tone, washier application of paint, and sort of a made-up scene, an imaginary scene. With Constable, you have a thicker use of paint. You have a brighter color. He comes from the early morning or late evening into the bright daylight, and you have a much better structured visual scene of the landscape. His trees are well constructed. The leaves grow at the ends of them. They form a very nice but crisp silhouette of the formation of the leaves around the tree. There's a richness, there's a depth to the land in Constable's landscapes. Slide, please. He painted constantly the countryside in England, traveling around. He had many friends' homes that he visited, and did many landscapes from certain areas, repeats of certain areas. Slide, please. Now, one of the little sketches, and these would only be about 5 by 7 inches, where the paint is slashed on in a frenzy that catches an effect of the moment. Slide, please. And he was one of the first painters of this direct application of paint, of where the paint was applied in a solid opaque layer in one coat, leaving it, getting the effect desired quickly, rather than building up these subtle transparent tones as Gainsborough and the earlier artists did. You have an immediacy to the painting in this way, a freshness to it that you cannot achieve by working in transparent layers. Slide, please. All of them more or less on the same scale. He was very interested in cloud effects. In fact, there are some paintings that are just clouds, no landscape in them. Beautiful effects. We'll see one at the end of the lecture. For the most part, his landscapes, the horizon line falls somewhere toward the middle of the canvas, where you have sort of an even presentation of sky and land. Neither one is dominant. The trees, usually on a feeling that you're on the level with the horizon line, the trees break into silhouette against the sky, or the lighter sky. Slide, please. Slide, please. This is a very famous one of his, a large composition at a country estate belonging to a friend of his, and it is probably an ideal constable to look at. The clouds are brushed on. They give a great effect of the stark white of the clouds, the sort of billowing effect of the clouds. There's a slight harshness to them. They're not blended in or muted out. But then the trees, the nice round solid trees, well structured, the light falling on the top surface of the branches, where you have deep holes punched into the trees with darks to establish the interior of the tree. And then the nice perspective of the rolling ground across the pond and then up the rise to the house centered in the middle of the painting. Slide, please. He liked the water, too. He used to go to a spot near Weymouth Bay, and it is some of these areas that he did several times over that you have almost an inkling of what the Impressionists tried to do many years later. Slide, please. Slide, please. Some of the tiny little things were just dapples of color. Quick sketches put down to be used later on in a full composition or a developed composition. Slide, please. His trees, when he gets into the interior, are dark, rich green. They're lush foliage, like full bloom of summer. Beautifully drawn, had complete knowledge of the tree anatomy and landscape anatomy. Slide, please. And he never did get into the more sort of sentimental type of art that Gainsborough did. They're just quick presentations, honest, straightforward. Slide, please. Slide, please. This is one of the Weymouth Bay series, and in this, although the clouds seem very abrupt and sort of a little dramatic for this, the canvases were washed, especially in the lower area, with a thin earth tone. And many times later in a series that he did of the Salisbury Cathedral, he would stain the entire canvas a fairly dark, warm brown, and then, in painting over, would let some of the brown show through the texture of the canvas weave. In looking at this painting close up, the whole lower front area is just a thin wash of paint, and then the rocks that form on the cliff and then down in the foreground are applied in heavier impasto of paint. Slide, please. And another view of Weymouth Bay. Slide. And another painting, much from the same view of the first painting that we saw of this area. The brushwork left very rugged in the sky in this. The paint built up. Direct painting. Slide, please. Slide, please. Another area that he painted many times over at different points of his career, so that we see within the same subject development of an artist's style, was Salisbury Cathedral. And you have this sort of open plain effect, or on the other side by the water, the reflection of the cathedral. This was done toward the middle and late part of his career, so that you have a much more vigorous brushwork on the paintings, some of them even being done with a painting knife. Slide, please. Slide, please. One of the quick sketches. These are in chronological order. Slide, please. In this painting, the Hay Wain, he sent to the Paris Salon in 1825, and it received a gold medal. And it so influenced Delacroix that he removed his entry, supposedly just to varnish it, and completely changed the effect of the painting. In this, Constable uses a broken color, not quite as far as the Impressionists take it later on, but in mixing different greens, he would apply dashes or strokes of paint of completely different, vivid shades of green, one next to each other, breaking up the surface of the object without then going back to blend them carefully together. In this, it sort of gives a quick spontaneity to the brushwork and gives a vibrancy to the painting that just cannot be achieved when it's evenly blended. It was this breaking up of color, and especially the whole light effect of the sunlight falling on the scene, that influenced Delacroix, and he removed his painting, the large painting, The Massacres of Scio, and lightened the entire sky and added some of these broken highlights of color on top of the figures. Slide, please. Another view of Salisbury Cathedral. By the way, Constable did not paint just quickly and rapidly, but many times, like in the Hay Wain, which was considered a major composition to him, there would be many sketches leading up to a certain painting, and he would even have full-scale sketches done in a very quick brush stroke to see how the composition was working out. Slide, please.